agus fáilseoireamh a rís fáilte a cháirtin leine fáilte dhéise ha as a Slàn MacNeacail Òrain hiiceasteach fáilte rá bhuile agus sé plach hóbór a chaun an dú fáilte chud Dr Ulrike Hogg a bheits bhí brín roin agus mis can Ulrike ha mi díreach san facail na gara maneuver a bheith agus go bheith sin an sásan an próiseacht há insin nach leis leorla náisiúnta na Halba agus má fáistin na cóbracha go bheith idiring ha cóistin adul agus ha Ulrike agus neachlé eile bhíacing tronseaching agus tóide foridan adul le bút an obrach le clám scola le bún an cóisnach agus sé díreach plach agus a haun a bhí mar fáiste. So my many thanks to Ulrike for coming and for being part of this wonderful collaboration, cooperation, which is up and running now between Slàn a-rithist Ostaig and the National Library of Scotland, as part of which we've had a in the middle of a wonderful week of work with Gaelic manuscripts, which the curators from the National Library have been able to bring up to Skye to share with us. And this is an extraordinary and wonderful event because I think it's the first time that they've been out of the National Library since they were deposited there for most of the manuscripts, isn't it?
Yes. Unless you count anything that's gone out as an exhibition loan. That would have been
So it's a real pleasure to be able to share these materials with the community and with children and with our community of scholars and students and researchers. And it's as part of that Ulrike has very kindly offered to give us today's talk, where she'll be looking at the Gaelic song collection of Reverend Dòmhnall MacNeacail. Ulrike is the curator of Gaelic, medieval, early modern and music manuscripts at the National Library of Scotland. So her remit is wider even than the Gaelic manuscripts themselves, though that's a huge responsibility in its own right. And she's published, as well as her curatorial work, she's published in the fields of Scottish Gaelic manuscript studies, manuscript collectors, and medieval and Renaissance historiography. So Shetlach Gàidhlig a haun fáilte chóireach. It's really wonderful to have you here, and we're looking forward to hearing what you're going to tell us about Reverend Dòmhnall MacNeacail and the collection.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Abby. I would just like to reciprocate and say we are so delighted with the warm and kind welcome we've received here at Slàn Mòr Ostaig. We've been looked after so kindly, and we really appreciate the fuss-free and helpful collaboration we've had with our probably quite demanding events around manuscripts. And so I feel very privileged to be allowed to give a talk here, but also as a fatally lapsed Gaelic learner, I'm also very terrified. So I hope you'll bear with me when I say anything in Gaelic or about Gaelic. And now this, as you will know, is about a collection that did leave the library as well and should not have left it, but we will not go into very much detail about this. Right, I will begin then. About 2.5 years ago, we received the news from Professor Robbie O'Malley in Glasgow that a number of Gaelic manuscripts that had been missing from our collections that had been rediscovered, and in the following they were returned to us. And it's easy to use hyperbolic language here, like I fell off my chair and all this, but I didn't. But so these manuscripts consisted of a large proportion of the papers of the Reverend Dòmhnall MacNeacail, minister of Lios Mòr, and some of the papers of the Reverend Dr Alexander Irvine, minister of Little Dunkeld. It's probably fair to say that we had given up hope of ever seeing them again, and we still can't express our delight at having them back. But this is not an account of what happened, because of some sensitivities still existing around the case, and because the circumstances are still partly very baffling to us. Instead, I would like to offer a first reacquaintance with these collections, especially MacNeacail's, after they had been missing from our library for about 55 years. Now, Dòmhnall MacNeacail and his younger colleague Alexander Irvine probably need no introduction, especially not as collectors of Ossianic ballads and other Gaelic verse and songs. I would like to focus mostly on MacNeacail here, whose collection was the more depleted of the two. His manuscripts had been deposited in the National Library in 1951, and we use the word deposited in its very limited sense of somebody placing his manuscripts in our library to be looked after, but retaining ownership. We do sometimes see some confusion about this. So the family retained ownership of the manuscript. They contain some material that relates to his work as a minister, such as sermons in Gaelic and English. Of his sermons, we've only ever had a small handful, which must have somehow become detached from the much larger collection of his sermons that's held in Glasgow University Library. However, MacNeacail is mainly known to us as a collector of Gaelic songs and as the fierce critic of Dr. Johnson's ill-informed comments on Gaelic literature and manuscript heritage, and the collection in our library relates to these two areas. Now, his upbringing in a family of Gaelic tradition bearers would have ensured that he was familiar with Gaelic songs from his earliest childhood. He seems to have begun collecting Gaelic verse while he was still in his teens. Most of his manuscripts are undated, but the first dated one has the year 1752 written at the top, when he was only 17. This manuscript contains an Ossianic ballad. The last dated manuscript bears the date 1777. He was 42 then, and his collecting probably continued after that date. But around this time, he also became very busy being outraged by Dr. Johnson and taking up his pen against him. Among his papers is also a manuscript draft of his remarks on Dr. Samuel Johnson's journey to the Hebrides, which he published in 1779. His songs were therefore brought together over a long period of time and amount to a substantial number of texts. Now that his song collection is once again complete, it might be worth, or it will be worth, having a closer look at it. The song manuscripts of most Gaelic song collectors of this time tend to have two main parts to them. Contributions made by acquaintances literate in Gaelic and texts written down by the collector himself. The first of these categories usually takes the form of a folder of loose material, that's in a library setting, which consists of song-related correspondence and texts of Gaelic songs sent to the collector by friends and acquaintances. MacNeacail didn't preserve many letters, but he has a small stack of material which was sent in by others. That's him. These contributions can give you many hours of amusement as you try to identify the scribes, often without result in the end. Why do we not know the scribes? Because usually these songs come as an enclosure in a letter, and the letter might have been signed by somebody, but it's lost, so we have only ended up with the enclosure. The second type of material in MacNeacail's own hand mostly looks like this, so somewhat dilapidated now, but that's the idea. These are the very typical ubiquitous booklets of Scottish collectors of any texts at the time, although they seem to be particularly common among Gaelic collectors. Most Gaelic collectors of the 18th century were ministers of the Church of Scotland. They had little time and not much money either, so making up your own homemade booklets was not expensive and seems to have been a universal skill at the time. And what you did was you folded one or two sheets of paper, and I'm using the Slàn a-rithist Wi-Fi information as a demonstration. So you folded your piece of paper once or twice, and then you had a little booklet and you just cut open the bolts. And if you were quite a diligent person like MacNeacail, then you also put some stitches through the fold. There are collectors who didn't bother doing this, and then the middle fell out and things got misplaced in the wrong order. All this has happened. Our younger colleague, Alexander Irvine, comes to mind in this context. But we now keep the booklets in individual folders. So that's when you call them up in the reading room, that's how they'll arrive. This, I should say, is the smaller size of our excellent acid-free cardboard folders. We've got folders which are about this big, and the booklets are perfect for them. And then we've also got these bigger ones which can take a foolscap sheet. Where am I? Right, but if we could stack them all on top of each other and add the single sheets on top, then we'll see that MacNeacail's song collection was never physically large. This impression is confirmed by a description made of it in 1871 by the folklorist John Francis Campbell of Islay. Campbell was given a loan of the collection by Ludovic Cameron, a grandson of MacNeacail. This was to allow Campbell to search through it for material for his printed collection of heroic ballads, Slàn a-rithist, which was published in 1872. Campbell said that MacNeacail's collection was brought to him in a tin tea chest of 10 by 7 by 7 inches, roughly, well, I had to translate that. So it's 25 by 18 by 18 centimeters. So it's a bit like a shoebox. Campbell was also aware that even at that point, the collection was no longer complete, although there seemed to have been no reason to think that any parts had been lost for good at that time. So he writes, in 1836, Mr. Dòmhnall MacNeacail of the First Royals, a son of the collector, had the papers in the West Indies and made some notes upon them. Dr. Smith may have seen them, and he certainly saw MacNeacail's sermons. An elder brother of Dòmhnall, who went to Calcutta and Australia, may have had some of his father's papers. And then he says, but the tin tea chest seemed to contain a fair sample of the collection mentioned in MacNeacail's published works. So he means Dr. Rant against Dr. Johnson and so on. So with hindsight, this strikes us as a statement of enormous stoicism, but this is why we're all so fond of Campbell, I think. He never actually makes a fuss over anything. However, the modest physical size of what's left of the collection now is no reflection on the richness of content inside. A very rough count shows that there are over 270 songs in this surviving collection. If we add the songs collected or composed by younger family members, we might be able to add another 100 or so, or slightly less. Now, when MacNeacail began his collecting, few of the songs known among Gaelic-speaking communities existed in any written form whatsoever. Against this background, MacNeacail's collection contains an enormous amount of material, and we shouldn't underestimate how pioneering this work was. The circumstances that prompted MacNeacail to begin and then to persevere with his collecting work have often been mentioned. He was 11 years old in 1746, the year of the Battle of Culloden, and the event and its aftermath would have shaped his perception of Gaelic language and Gaelic culture as being severely under threat, with the loss of songs and traditions speeded up by a variety of factors. As a response to that distress and upheaval, a small number of literate Gaelic speakers, like MacNeacail, began to write down and preserve a treasure of songs and ballads that was alive almost exclusively in people's memories. Like his colleague, the Reverend James McLagan of Blair Atholl, MacNeacail collected Ossianic ballads, as well as songs composed nearer to his own times, or even made by contemporary poets. As we have seen, MacNeacail certainly began to write down Ossianic verse in 1752, and before James Macpherson's first English adaptation appeared in print in 1760. And decades before the Highland Society of Scotland and its Ossian Committee saw the light of day. Some enthusiastic Gaelic collectors, especially of the late 18th and early 19th century, focused very specifically on collecting these heroic ballads in order to help with the investigation into the authenticity of the publications of Macpherson. But in MacNeacail's longer-standing, very miscellaneous collection, there are also circa 30 heroic ballads, and here's Campbell's list of them, and Campbell himself. However, there are no physical or scribal signals to suggest that he was giving them the elevated status that some of the later collectors gave them. He surely did give them a high status, but you don't see it in his manuscripts. And so Ossianic lays appear here and there with sometimes unexpected neighbours in the manuscripts. There are very few booklets that contain exclusively Ossianic ballads. Most of the time he doesn't keep them separate from everything else. We know of no surviving manuscripts of his in which they are all brought together, as we get, for example, from Alexander Irvine. In one of the booklets, for example, 3 heroic ballads are followed by a strangely irregular poem which are being used, MacNeacail described as a round Dararik or Pindaric ode, And then the booklet contains 2 walking songs, and then 1 song from the 16th century, and finally one of Ian MacKail and Peter Adar. So it's all very mixed. The non-Ossianic songs in his collection span the period from the 16th century to MacNeacail's own times, although some periods are better represented than others. We find here the full range of genres of Gaelic songs: death laments, love songs, occupational songs, spiritual songs, satires, songs of eulogy and clan rallies, or songs that recount battles or other events. Mostly they are the works of poets of the 17th century, or of poets who were born in the 17th century and passed away in the first few decades of the 18th century. These are the generations contemporary with MacNeacail's own parents and grandparents. MacNeacail's collection is invaluable in that it brings so many of these early poets together. Here's a very random list of early examples. So, Dòmhnall MacNeacail, the song, the Owl Song, and then the next one, he has the earlier version of Cruinneachadh, excuse me, and then he has the Irish poet Angus O'Daly and his clan satires, and another selection of highly uncomplimentary quatrains flung about by people displeased with each other around the year 1600. And then he goes into he has a lot of Keppoch poet and MacDonald material, few MacLean poets of the earlier ones. They do appear in the more contemporary class as well. And then Marinian Alstarue, he has 5 of them, and a-riamh na true is there as well. So some of these figures next to these songs may appear small, but it's worth remembering that the corpus or corpora of some of the best known early poets barely make it into double figures. Of Ian Dhu, the MacDonald poet, for example, no more than 11 songs are recorded in Colm O'Boyle's and Donald Macaulay's checklist of Scottish Gaelic vernacular verse to 1730. And out of these, MacNeacail had 5. Gillespie na Ceithidh has 9 known songs, and MacNeacail has 4. Marinian Alstarue has 11 assured ascriptions and plus some doubtful ones, and again MacNeacail has 5 of them. So his collection makes an important contribution to the preservation of the works of these early poets, even if he doesn't always provide ascriptions to them. He often gives their songs anonymously, where others are able to supply an author, but even then his versions are usually of very high quality. It's not the same picture for all his poets, sorry, and his collection is not always what we would expect. Sorry. One might think that geography would have played a part, and that somebody based in Lios Mòr would have rounded up the works of all the important Mull poets, for example. But in fact, the result from Mull is modest, and MacNeacail's poets are far more scattered, which makes you wonder how much of a field worker he really was. Personal connections and lines of transmission, especially in exchange with James McLagan, would also have played a part, and personal taste would have led to a natural selection process. In MacNeacail's case, we get the overall impression that those songs that he wrote down are the ones he thought worthy of preservation. We certainly don't find any song in his collection where an annotation indicates that on closer inspection he thought it was rubbish, and this is something we sometimes get in the collection of Alexander Irving. Now, as to the works of the contemporary poets, again, a random list here. He's quite good on Ian McCallan, and this again may have been transmitted from Mull while he was on Lios Mòr. And then a few other ones, they're very scattered. There's Alistair McVeish. I don't know where he was at the time. Was he still in Ardnamurchan? He must. And then Anger Dennis McAllister was in Glencoe. And we have a very long version of his Killiecrankie poem here. Then Lachlan Macpherson Fairs Ramashi was in Badenoch. James McIntyre of Glencoe was in Lochetif, where Deirdre and Nish were as well. Ian McCodrum was in North Uist. Lachlan MacNeacail was on Skye and his daddy. And then another South Uist poet, and Dougal Buchanan. He has some of his poems, and these are the only religious songs in his collection. And then, of course, there's Don Hubbard, whom he had a special and complicated relationship There are also many of the best known anonymous songs in his collection whose tunes were used again and again by later poets. And then also some walking songs. And then now what did Dòmhnall MacNeacail add? We have his Gaelic journal, which you can also see this afternoon, with some watercolors of the area around Achlian and Loch, where his mother's family came from. Dòmhnall was MacNeacail's youngest son, still a child when his father died in 1802, and the family had to vacate the manse and leave Lios Mòr, and they were in the following supported by his mother's brother in Achlian. He became a soldier who later went to the West Indies, but he was likewise a song collector and poet, and his poetry manuscript was among those that were lost and have now been returned. It contains his own poetry and a number of convivial and occasional songs, and also songs of contemporary poets such as Seamus MacLeish, or known as Seamus Shaw from Loch Ness. So this is a bit of a photographic disaster here, but you can just see Òrain le Seamus Shaw Bard Loch Ness. I think he writes Seamus. In some cases, he uses an SH to indicate a sh sound. Not always, so it's inconsistent. Right, and Dòmhnall's own songs, as we know, were published by George Henderson in the TGS, in the Transactions of the Gaelic Society of Inverness volume from 1908 to 1911, but of course, they're now being re-edited. I would like to spend a few moments now on some visual, scribal aspects of MacNeacail's collection. How did he enter the songs into his booklets? Here's a randomly chosen page. None of the contents of his manuscripts look like first drafts or rapid notes taken either during a singer's performance or in a race against time and memory loss after a performance. Such raw notes where speed was of the essence, we do occasionally find in the papers of other collectors. Again, our second younger collector, Alexander Irvine, comes to mind. I should have given him his own chapter here, who scrawled down some compositions of the 14th poet Donald Dewar. So this is one of his worst examples. MacNeacail's songs, on the other hand, are mostly fair copies, or certainly copies. What were they copied from? MacNeacail's own memory and that of family and friends would have contained a considerable number of songs. He would also, sorry, we've covered that. Never mind. It's just it tells me the what's under the green line is just that Donald Dewar was a 14th poet and died. And there we are. That's maybe better. And then we can always
we can bring it back down if we need it.
Yeah. So that's this is just the date of the man. Right. You would also have been aware of memory gaps, sometimes leaving blank spaces in his copies. In other songs, he may have written down after hearing them and then copied them out more neatly. He may also have copied songs received in already written forms from others. There is certainly evidence of some interchange between him and the already mentioned Reverend James McLagan, but there are others beside him. And while the page shown here is quite a tidy example, a more typical page opening looks like this. And this is still a copied version, calmly written, rather than the manuscript of a hasty, panicking scribe during or just after recitation. But I think it would be legitimate or certainly interesting to ask, in a very neutral sense, of course, whether this was normal. As we have seen, MacNeacail was among the earliest large-style Scottish Gaelic song collectors, and this meant that he and his colleagues developed their own way of writing down songs and verse. So what was, in their eyes, the best and clearest way of writing down verse? Were they influenced by printed verse collections? That would be the first question, of course. And as we have seen, MacNeacail's earliest dated manuscript bears the date of 1752, when he was only 17 years old. The second earliest date we find on a manuscript is 1755, when he was a divinity student at St. Andrews. The only non-religious Scottish Gaelic verse collection that had been published by then was Alistair MacFaischair-Alistair's Asheri na Shanchanan Albany of 1751. This, in turn, in its layout and general arrangement, was probably modelled on non-Gaelic poetry collections, although there's something quite featureless about it that could have been inspired by anything, as the sample page shows. Now, as we've said, the latest date we find on any of MacNeacail's song manuscripts is 1777, and by that time a few more Gaelic verse collections had appeared in print, such as Dougal Buchanan's hymns of 1767, Dòmhnall first edition of 1768, and Round MacDonald of Egg's big collection of poetry printed in 1776. But by now MacNeacail had probably found his own style. And we should also look at the traditions followed in poetry manuscripts of the time. His education would have made him familiar with non-Gaelic styles of writing verse or keeping commonplace books. But it would also be reasonable to ask whether something about MacNeacail's manuscripts also harks back even just slightly to earlier Gaelic manuscripts. There's, for example, a wish to give the songs he collected an organized, analytical, satisfying form. At the end of a song, he often writes cruinneachadh on the left. Yeah. We occasionally find something similar in contemporary non-Gaelic manuscripts, where people write finis, and the guy there, that's an 18th century Jacobite collection. In Scottish Gaelic and Irish manuscripts, however, we encounter it more frequently also as finet. So, finet, like a beàrnan or whatever. The word cruinneachadh as something that signals the end of a text sometimes makes its way into Scottish Gaelic printed collections, but in these it will usually only appear at the very end of the book, not after every song. And in a way, writing the end in any language at the end of a song is not necessary. After all, to see a song written down is to see exactly where it ends. But it rounds off a written song in a satisfying way, in the same way in which in older Gaelic poetry we can find the initial word or phrase of a poem repeated at the end as a dúnar. It's good to have something at the end. So here's an example. This is a Scottish one and quite near contemporary, where he begins with the big initial word at the top there is repeated at the end. And this is possibly a sign of a more Gaelic sensibility or of a tradition that had once been shared more widely but been lost in non-Gaelic scribal culture. I wouldn't presume to guess which, but there is another more practical reason why you might want to say exactly where a song ends, because a Gaelic collector, possibly more than poetry scribes in any other language, also had to grapple with the fact that few Gaelic songs had a title. In oral transmission, people found other various ways to refer to a certain song by its chorus or by its subject, anything. But for a scribe of these title-free works, this means that you might finish writing one song and then go straight into the first stanza of the next one. Some scribes then launch into writing a whole long explanatory paragraph instead of a title, but MacNeacail is not usually guilty of this. If anything, his manuscripts are much more pared down and free of paratextual matter than we would like them to be. We wish he was more wordy, but he definitely leans the opposite way, possibly out of a feeling that the interest of an outsider in his collection was by no means guaranteed. Sometimes he launches straight into a song without naming an author. Sometimes there's a rather generic title, but in about half of his songs we find neither the one nor the other. And so in a collection where titles are something of a luxury, it is helpful to structure your manuscript by signaling at least the end of a song. Other collectors opt for a horizontal line between songs, but MacNeacail uses this very rarely. What else can we see? MacNeacail doesn't write in the Gaelic script. That's probably stating the very obvious here. It had largely fallen out of use in Scotland by the time he became active as a collector. He does have a copied alphabet of it, which is not in his own handwriting, and he very likely engaged with sources that were written in the Gaelic script. However, this one here is quite a basic alphabet of capitals only, and they're not even all in Gaelic. And like all your so-called Irish alphabets written into the margins of manuscripts, it lulls you into a false sense of empowerment, because without any knowledge of the abbreviations or even the lowercase letter forms, you're still a bit at sea. So still, if we assume and MacNeacail had seen and used older Gaelic poetry manuscripts, then it might be of interest to remind ourselves what these looked like. The traditional Gaelic scribes followed certain aesthetic writing conventions that depended on the subject matter. When it comes to poetry, the most noticeable feature was their habit of marking very clearly, from about the 16th century onwards, the beginnings of every stanza or quatrain with an enlarged version of the first letter. Again, we've seen the right one before, and the other one is not any more beautiful, but these are very near to MacNeacail's own time. That's why I chose these two. Each and every stanza was marked like this. It resulted in an attractive, clear margin, and it also gave you some sense of control over your many verses. Reading poetry off a sheet like that with the initials so far apart was probably not so easy, but a final advantage was that you could save vertical space that way and didn't leave a blank line between stanzas. In MacNeacail's own time, there were still a few scribes who were able to write in this tradition, also using the Gaelic script, such as William McMurtry in Kintyre, for example. And there he even writes down a poem using the enlarged stanzas, although he moves them a bit closer to the text. In the Scottish Gaelic printed collections, large stanza initials, apart from the first stanza of a song, mostly fall by the wayside. The later 18th century was a period that found uncluttered pages much more attractive. Blank space is used to separate stanzas. Sometimes stanzas are numbered in capital Roman numerals, but we immediately see the drawbacks here. It's very cumbersome and there's a lot of openness to error as well. These are not false, but you sometimes get quite strange Roman capitals. For MacNeacail, writing down poetry with flamboyant initials, like the traditional Gaelic scribes, was of course not an option. That was too last century and also too Irish for a Church of Scotland minister. We would have associated the Gaelic script and its scribal conventions with Catholic Ireland. So what then could a Protestant minister do to separate the stanzas of a song? MacNeacail does not seem to have liked Roman numerals either, as they were used in the egg collection. So few scribes actually used that. Then there was the option of using blank space to separate out stanzas, but we can see that MacNeacail was enormously thrifty with his paper. He therefore does what seems the obvious thing, what nearly any other Gaelic poetry collector ended up doing. He numbers his stanzas in Arabic numerals, and sometimes he does it retrospectively and leaves us with a great find the number puzzle. So where the blue arrows are, if you see, he's put them, he's scribbled in tiny little numbers here. And this is just an example of a contemporary who found a different solution, which also is reminiscent of an older Gaelic manuscript with the numbers, the stanza numbers, instead of initial letters lined up beside the stanzas. And now the final question is, of course, was it pointless to number something that's already fixed in its sequence on paper? And there's a consideration that stanzas in his time could be of varying lengths, and some indication of beginning and ending was certainly helpful. It would probably not be safe to say that this pan-Gaelic numbering compulsion, and it's really everywhere, is still an echo of the practices of the methodical early Gaelic scribes. But we might state here that MacNeacail and his circle developed some scribal conventions that were associated with the unusual state of transmission of Gaelic songs. And this may have been a long way of saying something very obvious, but in a very early post-Colon collection, such as MacNeacail's, there could be some value in trying to trace his thought processes. Now, moving on, another point to note is that MacNeacail's song collection doesn't contain any musical notation. In his time, this was not at the forefront of a collector's mind. For most of MacNeacail's songs, no tunes are given. And again, the reason may be that he did not anticipate his manuscripts to be used by somebody from outside his own circle. There is a haphazard scattering of performance instructions. So sometimes he indicates passages to be repeated, but this is very vague and he often leaves you out hanging there. So, for example, for the top left, he writes encore next to the first stanza. And what does it mean? Do you sing every stanza twice? Does this stanza become the chorus? Nobody knows. The second one where you repeat the last line, we think that's fairly clear. You just do this for every stanza, but he only says it for the first stanza. And then here, the last one, again, he seems to indicate that you repeat the first line, but what if he actually meant you to repeat the first stanza? And is the first stanza then becoming the chorus? He doesn't have any instructions for any subsequent stanzas. And in some cases, this was never worked out. The one here down there is also in MacLagan's manuscript and has the same strange instruction, but we have no other early witnesses for this particular song. So nobody ever managed to find out what was really meant to happen there. For a private collection made by a man who experienced Gaelic verse and singing as a natural part of life, this would have indicated a degree of inner detachment if he had actually given detailed instructions that we cannot often detect in his collection. It's almost clinical in its complete absence of personal comment, neither for his own benefit or for others. There are some exceptions where he praises a song, but on the whole, this inky thumbprint, which is in accession 2152 /14, by the way, that could be nominated as one of the most personal parts of the collection. Now, as to the music, his main collecting activity took place before Patrick MacDonald published his collection of Highland tunes in 1784. For subsequent publishers of Gaelic verse, this was occasionally useful. John Gillis's collection of 1786 does refer to MacDonald tunes, as does the collection of Donald and Alexander Stewart of 1804 and Patrick MacFarlane's collection of 1813. And elsewhere, reference is made back to an earlier song on which the song in hand is modelled. If it's the earlier song itself that's printed, then sometimes the tune note makes reference to a later song that it's based on and possibly better known. So there's a bit of mental acrobatics required to unravel this sometimes. However, none of this was a concern for MacNeacail, who for a long time did not intend for any of his songs to be published. But then some of his collected songs suddenly make it straight into print, unedited and not very well selected. And this is something we could only really discover after the return of the missing manuscripts, because John Gillis's edition of the history of the feuds and conflicts among the clans with an appended song collection is straight based on MacNeacail. So this is the title page, and it only makes reference to a collection of curious songs in the Gaelic language published from an original manuscript. And the owner of the manuscript is nowhere revealed in the book. However, Gillis's songs have exact matches in MacNeacail's collection and come from 6 of his manuscript booklets. So here, I line them all up. So there, and you can see what a strange mixture it is. The first one is very, if I remember right, very scurrilous, scathing. Others are sort of about drinking, and then there's also the Òrain MacNeacail is in there, and some love songs which are perfectly nice. I mean, absolutely nothing wrong with them. So it's a very, very strange mixture. So John Gillis published another bigger collection of Gaelic song 6 years later in 1786, and for this he relied on the editorship of James MacLagan. The small collection of 1780 already, however, very faithfully replicates the text, orthography and layout of MacNeacail's manuscripts, and we have just 2 examples. Here you can see that the spelling is exactly the same. The only thing they did was take 1 H out of the sráine at the end of the first line, but everything else, the rather idiosyncratic spelling, is all retained in the printed book. And then the other one is a matter of layout. This is a song by John McCodrum, where it's got stanzas of 8 lines, and after the first 4 lines, there's a change in meter. So the first 4 lines go da 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 da, and then the second 4 lines have da 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 da. So you can also see it in the tune. And so MacNeacail takes 4 stanzas to notice this, and then he or maybe he didn't notice it, but he decides after stanza number 4 that he would like to signal this scribally as well. So the last 4 lines are now slightly moved to the right, and this also appears in the printed version. So there we have it. First 4 stanzas completely straight, and then the 5th one shows the same changes, and he goes all the way to the end. And look, Cruinneachadh is written there. And it's also in his own manuscript. Now, where am I? Yeah, so this is here, the stanza that indicates the change. And then he writes Cruinneachadh at the end, and the printed book takes that over. And the songs are partly quite rough, and MacNeacail later maintained that he had nothing to do with the publication. And I'm very grateful to Don William for a reference to John Lydon's tour in the Highlands. Can you remind me of the date? Was it 1807? 1800, where Lydon reports on a meeting with MacNeacail. MacNeacail, informed me that many of the Gaelic poems in the possession of his brother had been published very inaccurately by Mr. Hugh Macpherson in his Conflicts of the Clans. And this statement I find truly mind-boggling when the Gillis book seems so obviously based on manuscripts in his own handwriting and spelling, and not that of his brother. And also, who is Hugh Macpherson? I would really be glad to know. So perhaps some of what was really being said at the time was lost by having passed through the notes or memory of John Lydon. Now, as a postscript, not long, I would like to have a quick look at the papers of Alexander Irvine, some of which had also been lost and were returned to us. Irvine's papers were donated to the National Library in 1961, and they contain his song collection as well as correspondence that documents his work for the Highland Society of Scotland, for which he seems to have been something like an unpaid freelance expert and willing pursuer of oceanic quests. Born in late 1773, Irvine was just under 40 years younger than MacNeacail, and although devoted to the same cause, they were very different people. Where MacNeacail used his critical powers to tear Dr. Johnson to shreds, Irvine published on ecclesiastical subjects, and although he had great plans at all times, he never wrote anything substantial about Gaelic poetry before his life was cut short at the age of 50. MacNeacail's papers, as we have seen, are a democratic mix of Oceanic and other verse, and Irvine was one of the late 18th century Ossian enthusiasts who prioritized his well-documented Oceanic ballad collection over anything else. The more modern poetry interested him too, and he was also a singer, but he had no plans to publish this, but was going to use snippets of it from within a planned publication. He had The Lives of the Caledonian Bards, a dream of a lifetime that never materialized. And MacNeacail was by all accounts a modest, disciplined, kindly person, as long as he wasn't confronted with the writings of Dr. Johnson. Irvine's correspondence allows us to see that he got rattled more often and seems to have had a knack of terrifying incompetent people. The period in which he took part in the work of the Highland Society of Scotland's Gaelic Dictionary was one of conflict and mere communication breakdown. Their collections too show some differences. Both men kept work-related papers such as sermons in Gaelic and English, and project-related matters such as dictionary work. MacNeacail, of course, I should have said, was involved in this too, and he was one of the gentlemen who from circa 1776 onwards compiled the thing that's known as the Highland Gentleman's Dictionary. Each man also preserved a little stack of songs that were sent in to him by others, and each had a son and then later families who continued to respect their collections. So these are the 2 stacks of sent-in stuff. MacNeacail's own handwritten collection consists of fair copies. Irvine's collection contains a lot more raw material and even Gaelic-related correspondence, and gives us a livelier impression of the man himself. There are some manuscripts that clearly show the field worker at work, written fast and messily, sometimes with explanations thrown in by the performer, noted down at the bottom of the page. And while such a collection is highly attractive, his handwriting is the only fly in the ointment. The fair copies is what other people sent him, while he himself did not always get round to rewriting his own rough notes. In some cases, he may have taken comfort in the belief that other people were actually able to read his handwriting, or even his orthography, on which he also had his own ideas. In at least one case, he seems to have thought it was all not a priority. And that's back to our man Donald Dewar in Fortingall, the one we have already seen, and he dockets a little manuscript of songs by him. Donald Dewar's songs, natural, easy, and humorous, sometimes elevated, seldom above mediocrity, sometimes vulgar, flat, and depressed. So he was quite judgmental on the whole. So not much had been missing from Irvin's collection during the past decades. However, one of the manuscripts that have now been returned to us is another very important example of a fieldworker's notebook. So this is Irvin's collection of songs of Rob Down, with a note by him. These poems were taken from Janet Mackay, daughter to Rob Mackay, before Duncan MacIntyre, poet, this 22nd of December 1800 at number 17 Thistle Street, Edinburgh. So you had a lot of big names in one room. This small notebook contains 17 songs of Rob Down, which should complement the sources that already exist of his songs. There's also a small collection of songs by others, including Irvin himself, who occasionally tried his hand at festive songwriting and also performing his own songs. And finally, the other returned Irvin document that I would like to highlight is a letter to him by James McLagan, dated 1802, when Irvin was 29 and McLagan was 74. We find references elsewhere in Irvin's correspondence that he was familiar with McLagan's song collection and dictionary work. However, this is the only evidence I have come across that the two were in friendly contact and direct contact with each other during McLagan's own lifetime. And the letter is full of kindness towards Irvin, who was a missionary in Bunrannoch at the time, and as yet without a wife and family of his own. And McLagan says that his whole family salute him, and he's very friendly. Even to sign your friend and servant is not a given at the time. It's quite strong, and do come back soon, and I owe so much to you. So, and he's handing a piece of work over to him because he thinks Irvin will do it so much better. So it's a very kind letter, and I was really delighted to find it. And this is the end of the talk, and delight is the word. We can't really thank Professor Robbie Mullally enough to have found these manuscripts, and that they're back with us now and nearly all fully catalogued now. Thank you very much.
Míle Ulrike an òraid còinneachadh agus just chum cleanting barrow cruinneachadh còinneachadh so down. It's really wonderful to get a sense of what the collection's like and also the impact that those early collected materials have on the way that we see still the tradition published and then access today. It's really important, I think, to have that in mind, how strong the influence of the work of those early collectors on what we end up thinking of as the standard now. It's wonderful to hear how far-reaching some of those decisions you can see him making in his manuscript layout are.
Yes, I did think it was obvious, you know, but then I thought, why do they actually number anything when they're writing it down? What's the point of it? And then I thought, what might have gone through his head? Why would he have done it?
Oh, well, I'm sure there will be questions and comments and thoughts and all sorts of things. I can see questions already coming in online. Can we maybe turn off the PowerPoint now, and then we can see our colleagues online and
Fydni iriorifse na cameras acu chruinneachadh agus nuair sin fud sin le hello please do feel free to put your cameras on at this point and let me know if you've got questions or comments. I can't see everybody all at once on the screen. So if you'd like to either write something in the chat or use the Zoom little hand that you can put up to say that you're here, then I'll know that you're waiting. And Rob's had a question lined up for ages and ages. I think the first half of your talk, Ulrike. So Rob, but it's on chéisteach agus céisteach de Ulrike.
Futi mi sinna no tapal let mór Ulrike agus tapal líise chárstin hu ag Slàn a-rithist agus an sré haispeaníon bhachomá agus an haispeanig dú agus am cínteach an cóirstú bhúla gon cóirst na péperan agus na làmh-sgrìobhainnean na réomhúla. Beàrnan sa bhí ach
Beàrlinne.
chicken law. Three things. The first that I wrote early on, Ulrike, while you were talking about poetry ascribed to particular poets. I was just wondering whether there were any of the poems that had not appeared in any other source, either manuscript or printed collection. In other words, something that's completely new, or I think you hinted at this in a couple of cases, perhaps versions of a poem that had been collected and recorded in a manuscript or indeed printed, but I wouldn't say a more complete, but a longer version, or a version that contained verses, passages that didn't appear elsewhere. And the second question was much simpler, which is right at the very end. Great to hear that the catalogue has almost been completed, and I was just wondering whether it'll be available, say, online in the near future. Of course, we are quite close together, although not today. So I'd be very, very happy to pop up and pay you a visit. But thank you, a wonderful presentation in every way.
Thank you, Robin. Well, the second question is much easier to answer. If you go into the manuscripts catalogue, it's all there. So, and it's a bit complicated because we catalogued the manuscripts that had not been missing under a different number than the other ones, but it's all cross-referenced and explained. So hopefully you'll have no problem finding it. I think MacNeacail does have quite a few poems which only he has, or where he is the earliest witness. I think that impression is given by quite a lot of the publications of the Scottish Gaelic Text Society. MacNeacail often stands all alone or is the earliest witness. So I think he, in that respect, he is quite a special collector.
Great, thank you.
Please be a show with question, Ruige.
Thanks, Ulrike, for that. It's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
I guess the Presbytery of Lorne is an important circle, which is drawing on. When you look at the people that were, not just minister for the Presbytery, but also were like apprentice ministers there before moving on somewhere else. You get Patrick MacDonald coming in. You get Donald Smith coming in. They're all learning from each other.
Yes.
And clearly, when they're after their meetings, they sit around and have songs. And there's one songbook where they sort of launch into anti-Catholic, satire against priests and things. And that's clearly the ministers coming together and having a go.
Yes.
So that's interesting. I think that's where the Patrick MacDonald connection starts.
Yes.
There.
Yes, only you don't see it in MacNeacail's manuscripts, which is really a pity. But you think Patrick MacDonald might have been inspired by seeing all these songs, or by the songs which were alive in their community.
Yes, yes. Yeah. The other thing is just his brother, who was clearly out in America. Well, we know he was killed there, and I just wonder, when we'll be looking at the Alan MacDonald Knox papers later on, and there's a coffee baron sweeper there, and there's a priestly satire there, which again appears in MacNeacail. So, did this you know, how did this get out to the soldiers in Halifax, which Alan MacDonald was?
I can't get my head around this at all.
Yeah.
Anything that involves Alan MacDonald is just.
Yeah,
I've
yeah,
got
no,
this.
it's very interesting comparing the two. Because Alan MacDonald, you know, there is stuff that you can get MacNeacail and MacLachlan, and there is stuff again which is utterly unlike it. Because Alan MacDonald has got no time for chiefs and gentry or anything like that, so we can't be bothered recording their stories. I want out who Hugh Macpherson is, but my computer has just broken down, so I can't get into my file.
Well, I couldn't
and
get
look at it.
The reason why I used this Wi-Fi instruction sheet was that I can't get into the Wi-Fi. Yeah. So no, I've really tried, and it's just there in John Lydon, and I think that's the only reference to him.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, he was clearly very upset that he had, you know, his brother, I guess, had taken the papers and given them to, you know, when the Gillis did his sort of pàirt edition of the you know, big Schoolis, the guide originally printed it at the time.
But to say they were inaccurate is maybe not.
No, it's not. It isn't. And I guess one last thing I was going to say is, you know, James Irvin Robertson, who has got such a huge collection of material connected with the Irvins.
That's the one we bought. We bought that collection,
yes.
But he kept it online, all the transcriptions. But everything that's online is actually with us.
Really?
Yeah.
Everything?
Yeah. Yes, I can send you the. Yes, we got the whole thing. It was in big Muniment chests.
Goodness me, that's been keeping me up at night.
Worried
about what's going to happen to these.
Oh no, he sold it to us and then he went to France.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yes, I can send you more about
that's
that.
Great. It's so much. I guess the other thing I was going to ask you, have you been to Highland Health Society? Sorry, everybody's leaving as well. You know,
Make you stop.
Have you looked at the urban stuff in the Highland Society of Edinburgh?
Yes,
as well?
yes, some excellent letters in
it's really, yes. Yeah.
Irvinish letters.
Right. Listen, I don't want to stop Donnelly asking any more questions. Would anybody else like to ask a question?
I have a question. That was lovely. It's very, very interesting to hear the sort of social side of how different they were, not just dry manuscripts, but the background you told us. I remember Dòmhnall MacNeacail in Aberdeen used to lament the loss of these manuscripts because he said it would be impossible to edit, rub down correctly, because only these manuscripts, now this is from my question is, I can't remember what it was, I think it was only these manuscripts would show kind of the dialect forms. Do you know kind of what Donald would have thought these manuscripts could supply that aren't in the current published collection?
It's difficult to see that. And then with Irvin, you get the problem that he had his own ideas about orthography as well, and his spelling is sometimes very strange. It's a bit like modern Irish spelling. You know, he didn't like many sort of soundless consonants together. He thought it looked embarrassing, and this was one of the reasons he was so unsuccessful in his dictionary works. He wanted to reform the spelling as well as the rest of the Gaelic language in a prescriptive way, and so sometimes that doesn't help in making out anything he writes. You know? So I don't know how it would have helped in that respect. And then also it's very hard to read, but I think Ellen Beard might be able to.
I was thinking.
Yes, she knows about this and she's working on it. Yeah.
Great. Do you have a plan to photograph the whole collection?
We'll try, but it's quite fragile. So it needs a bit of preparation, but definitely I would like to organize that. Yes.
Thanks.
I had a question which was really about those choices he was making around layout on the page, and that idea that you would use Phoenix or an equivalent as opposed to the traditional dheth must mean that his access to traditional, if you like, Gaelic manuscripts must have been pretty limited, and especially if he's not really confident and competent with the alphabet. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on what that might mean for your understanding of his sense of what he was up to when he was making those collections. If he wasn't following in a literate Gaelic tradition, if you like, what is he using contemporary published poetry as an inspiration? Is it?
It's a difficult question. I think he had a few challenges. You could just use contemporary manuscript culture and published editions and just use the best parts of it. But he had this problem that it was quite difficult to see where stanzas ended and where one poem ended sometimes. And he had very little paper and he seems to have been a bit mean with his papers. He covers all his pages from end to end, maybe through many constraints. So I think it's an adapted version of contemporary manuscript culture, but one that takes into account a few things that apply only to Gaelic songs.
Can I ask a question? Do you think if you look at the earlier examples of the poetry which you've given us and the latter ones, can one deduct that there were changes in the social environment and the health style and all that sort of thing, quite apart from the poetry? Can one get some factual deduction, shall we say?
I'm not sure I can answer that. You would really have to go into the texts for that.
Yeah.
And that could maybe be done by other people. No, I'm afraid
That's
but he wasn't. Doesn't seem to be very judgmental anyway, and he accepts everything. There's some rough things there, and sometimes a bit, doubtful and taste. But he does keep these poems as evidence, or maybe just to have the complete picture of what people were singing or telling each other at the time.
Yeah.
But I'm sorry, I can't really answer that question.
It's the wrong question, but thank you very much. I enjoyed your presentation indeed. Thank you.
Sabhal Mòr, any others of our online colleagues would like to come in? No, I think they're happy. Any last point? Oh, Rebecca, go for it.
Yeah, thank you. That was really interesting. I've also been thinking about sort of how he was writing these notebooks and sort of the practicality of maybe him not having very much paper. And I think he was saying that it was interesting that he was sort of mixing texts and genres and stuff, but that the Ossianic stuff wasn't all sort of separate notebooks, but everything sort of mixed together. And I was wondering if that might be this sort of pragmatic way of trying to preserve the paper and just writing in one notebook rather than leaving space and using separate notebooks for different texts and then going back and forth.
It could be that, but I think at the time he was collecting, he also I think this was before the great interest in Ossianic verse had begun, and he I think it never occurred to him probably. I mean, Irvine, for example, he had this fair copy of all his Ossianic poems with indication of who had recited it to him, in whose presence and where this was, and even the date, sometimes even the time of day. And he had several copies made of this so that they were preserved and could never get lost, and because it was all helping in a great cause to show that Scotland had a literature that was older than Homer and all this. And MacNeacail just accepted them as part of the culture around him. So probably.
So you think he's not thinking of categorization in that way at all? Or?
No, it doesn't look like it. Sometimes he has several Ossianic things in a row in his booklet, but it's very,
That might just be the order in which it was sort of told to him. Or
possibly, yes. As he was going along, filling his. Yeah, it could be.
Like maybe people were just telling multiple of them in a row because they sort of go together.
Yes,
not as a category, but as sort of like connected by the characters or the.
Yeah, I was going to ask that someone could analyze them series by series in the order they appear.
Yes.
And try and deduct some sort of thematic thing from the fact that it came from a Chaidh house, came over the course of an evening, and it's then being remembered weeks later.
That's what I thought, and it probably reflects the way these songs were sung on a typical evening, you had a few of this sort and then a few different ones. Yeah.
And it'll depend on who's there and
Yes,
what they've got and
exactly,
how the
yes.
chat goes that sets up. Yeah,
Yeah.
really interesting.
There's definitely, yeah, there are definitely themes that you can see, and everybody started piling in.
Yes, I mean, you also see that in the earlier printed collections, you know, one theme always seems to lead to another, you know, and every song is linked to the previous one, either by the author or by the subject or something else. So it's still as if they were still very much written for Gaelic speakers who were still within that world, and that's how they progress through an evening.
May I ask another question, please? What aspects of Dr. Johnson's writing particularly maddened MacNeacail?
Well, he thought there were no Gaelic manuscripts older than, now what was the date?
100 years.
Oh, yeah, or if that, yes. So he thought there was nothing there and there was no older literature. He just didn't think that could be possible. And that was just the impression he had. I mean, I actually really like Dr. Johnson, but this he shouldn't have said because he really upset everyone.
He also had a huge go at St Andrews University, where Nicola and all his friends had attended as well. He had no time for St Andrews.
Yeah, oh yes.
That's just a grudge.
Yes, I think so, yes.